stream delta. So it's a shallow patch, and so the tide comes in, and it's just on the last amount of the high tide that pushes over. So this actually ponds over the low tide. The water is that deep in the channel, and if you walk down further up into the stream, it quickly is that deep. So the discharge, at that low tide time, the discharge tends to accumulate up here. If you have a series of spring tides, that high tide level suddenly progressively gets larger and larger and larger, and what we found is as soon as it gets above about 0.6 metres, you get much larger volumes of seawater from the harbour coming into this upper stream area, and consequently a lot more dilution. So your spring tides are when you see a big reduction in the accumulation of TEN. Effectively, that seawater is coming in and diluting it. When your rainfall comes down, that further dilutes it. So the question about what your concentration is a function basically of those two things. There are some more technical complications I don't want to bog you down with, but there is a reason why we, as part of the EMMP, why we feel it's really important to characterise what those freshwater inputs are, because unless we have those, it's quite hard to know exactly what's happening. So you need to have a good handle on the freshwater inflows.
Yeah. The moment your freshwater input is just based on the calculation and for mean annual overflow.
That's right. So we use the we've used the mean annual low flow and we've used the median flow. Yeah.
And is it what you're showing us? Is that cumulative, or is it just back and forth without any accumulation from the tide going back?
This is accumulated over a 20-day model run. So what we're seeing is starting off with a 0 and then building on top of that.
The concentration, when you show it up around the plant and out the drain and down the drain, is high, is at its highest point. Is there, might be a design aspect, I'm not sure, is there any reason, can you just go back to it, it shows actually the nitrogen concentration right back up, and I think there was one, and it was is that one, it goes right back into the diffusion years as well. Would that be just a factor of the discharge? Yeah.
That is critical, because I stood at this location and see fresh water passing through into the.
Because as we understand, the tide does come up and it shows before comes back right into those diffusion years, doesn't it?
Yeah, Ash would be able to talk better than me, but I've stood at the hurricane YFX and watched.
Yeah, I mean, that, at the end of that track, that's what the plant water is.
So what I'm saying is this correct, that there is that high nitrogen concentration through the drain, out, and then it's not until it comes into contact with the estuary, freshwater, tidal, that then dilutes it?
I think you'll see a kind of a step change in dilution here, and then I think that as soon as you, as the model shows, as soon as you kind of get down to the backside of the delta, so we talked about that kind of 20% dilution, and then it's a kind of a 1% by the time you get to the rim. And the other thing to recognise is in the table you'll see some kind of numbers down the right hand side. the reality is the levels of this concentration, they're whipping from nothing to a peak sometimes.
Right.
So through each semi-diurnal tidal regime, each tide cycle, you've got levels climbing and down, climbing and down. And so I've tried to simplify quite a complex picture in the table. The reality is it's, and so, yeah, we just need to, we're talking about averages. Yeah.
So these are models showing what comes out of the wastewater treatment plant to go further upstream under the bridge. Is that what they're showing?
That's what this is showing. So this is our base case. So in my chief of evidence, we use this as the base case.
Do you want to look at the drone footage of the, might be used to stream? Well, we did last time, and yeah, because you can't actually on site.
Yeah.
Tell them that.
No, my post is blind.
Can you talk about it? So that
Yes.
You started to get mate.
Gillian's not going to look, she was getting seasick with mine. So here is a treatment plant, obviously, and I'll we'll wait till I steady, sorry. Yeah. So here is the discharge drain, and it's coming through.
we walked to the end of the drain
Yep.
before it sort of, it wouldn't have been there.
Okay.
It would be back up, and it sort of does a bit of a dog.
Yep. So there's the discharge drain, and here is the Matarangi stream, and this is taken at high tide. So you'll see lots of reflection of water through these areas, and so at low tide, obviously that they won't be full of water. And here's the treatment plant, and the discharge is travelling out through here and out through this drain, and this is kind of where you'd expect to see highest concentrations.
And maybe it's like, hey,
Around in this area. Here is the bridge.
So it backs up well above the bridge.
Yep, and the tide pushes up through underneath the bridge.
Yeah.
So the purpose of this was to validate water levels in my model, not to present it at hearing. I apologise for this. But where we did our dye spread experiment was we put in an amount of dye in the discharge location on a neat, it was a low amplitude high tide, and we flew a drone over the top to map the spread of that dye, and we ran a simulation in the hydrodynamic model to compare the extent of that dye spread. Is that helpful?
Yeah, really.
What this video is not showing is that further up. Oh, here we go. We're moving down. So this. This shows that basically around the treatment plant, a lot of really low-lying land and salt marsh that Fiona can talk to in her evidence, and mangrove forest around here.
Not sure who this question should be to, but in the previous evidence, or not evidence, submitted back from Ngāti, there was a reference to a western drain. Was that the one Is that the one that comes out sort of through that salt marsh?
Ash, do you know about the Western Drain?
Yes, the one that you just saw.
Yeah. Yes, yeah.
I don't, not coming this way.
No, going across.
On the left.
On the
Talking
left.
about another one coming from the
Real
left.
parallel.
Yeah.
Left of the pond.
Just that line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, right. Okay. Thank you. I was thought it was just coming across the.
No, I think it's just neutral.
Yes, yes. Yeah, it's computer. Thank you. Very good. Thank you. To you.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Coulter. I've got a few questions. Yeah, I mean, my first question, so this is from reading your modelling report, my first question was around, you talked about the scenario-based versus mass balance models, and I was going to get you to explain the difference, and if you proposed to do it later, but you kind of answered that question in your rebuttal evidence about that it's not worth doing mass balance type models at this stage of the process model. Is that simply because there isn't enough baseline information at this time?
I'd agree.
Yeah. Thank you. Because it was a pretty restricted, limited data set that you were working with, wasn't it? It was 2019, 20 over what, maybe a few days, I think, or quite short.
Between 1 and 2 weeks.
About 1 or 2 weeks. And I appreciate that it's addressing the peak time, so I can understand why that was. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, you talked about, sort of following on from that, you did talk about the need for further modelling. My question was, when should this be done, given there are some limitations in the current modelling? And if you think about it in terms of the question in terms of our ability as decision makers to determine whether effects have been characterised sufficiently, what's your view on that?
Well, as I understand it, the EMMP is planned for, there's 4 years of monitoring leading up to the new plant, and then a further 4 years required. I think about 4 years leading up to that or at least enough 3 or 4 years of data would be useful for the freshwater inflows. And I actually think that tightening up the temporal resolution of that sampling so that we can start looking at changes in levels with the tide would be helpful from the outset. But I hope it would make sense to do it over that similar time frame.
Yes. So when you say tightening up, do you mean higher resolution model?
Every laboratory testing of samples that are gathered within hours of each other over a time cycle. Yeah, I think that would really improve our understanding of how the treatment plant and also the water quality in the wider harbour.
And so are you saying that after that first 4 years, you want to further work on the model?
I think so. I think it's about building confidence in the hydrodynamic model, not expecting that we're going to validate a water quality model using a conservative tracer. So the water quality model is essentially mimicking like a dye in the water, and it doesn't kind of tell the whole story.
Without the hydrodynamics. What do you say?
No,
What do you mean? It
kind
doesn't,
of,
doesn't tell the whole story. Well, because it doesn't have biological process and all that sort of, all that.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And so I think that even collecting laboratory testing of water samples, even then I think there'll be difficulties validating a water quality model based on that. And there is a question about where you put your effort, and I think it makes sense to for that to sit in monitoring. It becomes a question of joint probability too, and specifically looking at the occurrence of droughts. If you're focused on, and the as Ash pointed out, what return period you'd expect to design a plant for in terms of performance.
So I just want to make sure I understand this. You said that tightening up the resolution of sampling, just to make sure I understand that would help to improve the predictability of the hydrodynamic model. Is that what you're saying?
No,
I might have got my wires crossed.
No, that's all right. So I think in terms of the EMP, and my understanding is that we're looking at additional monitoring of water levels and velocities at the bridge.
Sorry, I think so.
And also water levels at the ramp. And the reason we want to do that is twofold. First, we want to improve our understanding of freshwater inputs in that system, because at the moment we've made quite conservative assumptions about what levels of freshwater go in, and we know how sensitive it is on water quality from the plant. And the second is because we have a longer term data set to potentially go back and use that with the hydro model that we have. And that's about the hydrodynamic model.
Yep.
In terms of water quality, a tracer is still good in terms of identifying those key drivers that are pertinent to water quality, but they don't tell the full story. And I think that the modelling results look at TM values of nutrients coming from the plant. They don't consider what's coming in from the hub. And so having that monitoring gives us contextually better information. And it is still worthwhile, like I have in the initial report, to compare the results with what a tracer might indicate. It's just that next level of detail in terms of a fully validated process-based water quality model, that is another big leap forward in the absence of that data.
So yeah, because I guess what I'm concerned about is that the way that the modelling outputs have been used, outputs to Mr. Cochrane, as if the outputs of the water quality model are indicative only, then trying to use them in a resource consent process, you want some certainty around what levels will be reached and therefore what responses that you make as a consequence. It's like, how reliable can we be at this stage, or how confident can we be at this stage that those numbers that have the model has generated can be used in that way. It's my concern. And I guess I had also assumed, and that's not necessarily a question for you, I guess. And I also have the concern, that if there's if this water quality model is as good as it gets, no reflection on you, but just in terms of going forward, if the focus then becomes on gathering more baseline data, but that doesn't effectively improve the reliability of the model. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, I think you could get a much better model from with unlimited resource. I just think that if you were to plan out the most sensible low effort series of steps to build confidence, the first step would be to better characterise freshwater inputs. The second step would be more comprehensive understanding of the baseline from a water quality, from the total nitrogen perspective, and a sampling regime that reflects tidal variation, so little bursts rather than a couple of measurements.
Yeah.
And then from there, then there are a number of options that you could go down that path to build further CFD. They don't necessarily include a improvements of water quality model. That's one of them. The other thing could be more a different approach to monitoring. So, so you could more intensively monitor.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to labour on that.
No, it's a good question.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and again, I guess, I was interested in that system linearity analysis. I thought that was quite an interesting thing to do. And I guess, again, my concern was around how reliable, because it does rely on a relationship between the modelled total concentrations and the measured concentrations. And given the limited amount of data that is actually available to, measured data is available, and the fact that the observation that the model tends to overestimate the concentrations at those points where there is model data, which is quite limited. So there's a whole lot more model than there is data. So how does that affect the reliability of the interpretation of that linearity analysis?
So every model run that I did would take almost a week to run.
My husband's a modeler. I know about that. From that
I'm just playing for everyone else's benefit. And so you need to be selective about what cases you're running, and system linearity is if you increase the mass of a discharge and you want to know how that might affect concentrations elsewhere in the model, what you can do is you can make an assumption that if you proportionally increase what you put in, it proportionally increases the concentration everywhere else. It's a hugely convenient outcome, because it means you don't have to run too many models. You can say, if I'm going to put in 2 kilograms instead of a kilogram, I'll get twice as much concentration. And that is the purpose of testing that. And what I found was that if you increase your dosage and you say by twofold, it won't, the model, if you model it, it will be slightly less than twofold.
Mm-hmm.
But so you can simulate, you can prorata concentrations up with an increased discharge and result in a conservative finding. But the warning is, if you do the opposite, it can be unconservative. So it was put there to try and build future utility into the modelling results, so that if Ash, for instance, comes up with a slightly different number, we can cross-correlate the results without rerunning that model.
In terms, you made a comment about there was no dye testing under the spring tide conditions, and I was just wondering what the implications of that for the model is in terms that's part of your validation process.
Yes. No, I agree. Ideally, that would have been good.
Yeah.
If that was, particularly if that was a case that we were concerned about, there are a number of things, even if we just step back from the model and look at just what we measured. We had our salinity gauges up by the bridge, and what we found is those salinity levels decreasing over those low altitude high tides, and then suddenly becoming very saline as soon, and everything pointed to much higher levels of dilution, and so it was less of a concern.
I was interested in this, and it actually relates to the table here. In terms of freshwater input, you made a comment, this is in your report, accurately accounting for freshwater contributions remains one of the most complex aspects of the study. And then, so I was then a bit intrigued to see why you then rated that as being of low significance, as something you needed to do. Or that.
We can sort of say low significance.
We can say that. It was in, sorry, it's in table 6.3. This is table 6.3. Oh, sorry, I might be completely. I'll have a wee look at your report.
Oh, table 5.3 in the achievement.
Oh, it's in your evidence as well.
I'm not sure.
Because I tend to write questions as I read things. So I read the report and then I read your evidence. So could both. Sorry about that. It may well be, sorry, I don't know.
Can I just start there?
Yeah, well,
Can I just ask a follow-up question to, and I'm not scientist, so bear with me, but the information that we've just identified that would be useful to improve freshwater information, the novelty of the set that a dynamic model, tidal variation, is that the sort of information that the EEMP is looking at improving? I guess the question is, are you confident that all those things that you've identified, that the modelling and the understanding of the, how the discharge works within that environment, those things that you could be better understood, are they adequately in the environmental management plan?
Yes, I understand they are. And they are detailed, as I understand. I spoke with Mr. Cochran this morning just to be double sure that we're considering water level measurement, velocity measurement at the bridge, water level measurement at the ramp, and laboratory testing to characterise the baseline levels out to harbour and up close to the discharge, with multiple samples being undertaken within a tidal cycle. Yeah.
Yeah, it was in your table 6.3, and you've got a column there, level of significance to modelling results. Yeah, I'm not going crazy. And it's the rainwater effects.
Just in the report.
Oh, yes.
This is in the report. Considered likely to result in lower agriculture. So you said on that basis that it was low, but it was just that your comment was that, that it was the most,
Yes.
one of the most complex aspects remaining of the.
And I think that's not clear. I think it should be level of significance. When I say low, I think the reason I put that there is because I considered it wasn't contributing to the worst case that I was fixated on, which was, so I suppose this table didn't feature in my first report, and it was really when there are a few, we need to think more about the kind of indicative recurrence of these levels rather than focusing on the worst case. It was how often is that worst case occurring. And so at this time, I was focused on that very worst case situation. So, but you're right, I can see why.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's good. And then I just had a question. We're talking about background concentrations and the fact that they're not included in the model. That's right, isn't it?
That's correct.
So what are the implications of not including them in the model?
Well, it means if there are other sources of TN running into the estuary, that is a water that is flowing up in the flood tide, that will increase the levels of TN in the upper reaches of the stream.
Yeah, it is as simple as that, isn't it? And is the model that you have set up now, is it capable of incorporating background?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is that something in the DMP?
Yes.
Is the measurement
Cumulative or
Oh, no,
the
that'd be
baseline sort of what's there now? Is that what you're talking about? No?
Yes, well, it is the baseline because it's the back. No, it's not baseline.
Oh, okay.
It's the background. It's what the concentrations are without the discharge.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's not an EUP, it's something to measure.
Well, through your chair, I'm probably the person to answer this.
Yeah.
We're proposing monitoring at State Highway 25 and Matarangi, which we think is sufficiently upstream to provide background, and then at the boat ramp, which we think is sufficiently downstream to sort of generally be outside of the influence of the discharge. Now, I'm not saying that it will completely be outside the influence of the discharge, but that's a reasonable baseline downstream. So we'll have two control points, an upstream control point and a downstream.
Just to add to that, with the modelling, seeing it looks like the discharge flows upstream, would you be any benefit of monitoring further upstream past the bridge? Or would it be feasible?
There are two bridges. There are two bridges, State Highway 25 bridge and also bridge. The State Highway 25 bridge is not in the flow zone, right, bridge.
So can you just clarify that?
No, I think the Matarangi bridge at Matarangi Road would be the logical upstream place to monitor for a range of practical as well as scientific reasons. What Mr. Quilter is talking about is we need a place to link to some of these things too. Working on the bridges is one place to do that. Go further upstream, we end up with some logistical issues in terms of getting access to that. Now, having said that, Ms. McIntosh was talking about monitoring of intertidal estuarine areas upstream of the bridge in terms of ecological monitoring as well.
But would that include water quality?
We've got water quality at Matarangi Bridge.
No, we're talking about upstream of that area, doing some monitoring as well, right? Isn't that what you just said? That you're doing?
There's some ecological monitoring further upstream in the intertidal areas.
So it's water quality is part of ecology.
My understanding is it's around ecological parameters in terms of macro, micro, and those types of things. We're not per se suggesting any further water quality monitoring upstream from Matarangi Bridge,
Okay.
with the exception of that control site in St. Highway 25.
That's all the questions I have for Mr. Porter.
While we're on the modelling report, I just had a question. I think it's paragraph 6.11. To do with overtopping. I know you weren't here in the previous hearing, but at that stage, I think we drew evidence that overtopping was not going to be an issue. And I'm just wondering with the modelling now undertaken, whether that was being revised, because I think there was a reference to the possibility, and this is of the drain, of the discharge drain. Here, stream bank overtopping under 6.11. And it's just as there is less tidal exchange of downstream and main during the tides compared to during spring tide, there is also less exchange of the surrounding mangrove, and conversely, overtopping during spring tides increases exchange, which leads to crushing and reduces accumulation. So it seemed to me that there was indicated that there would be some overtopping during those periods. Is that
Yeah.
or?
Overtopping, we often use that to describe an unusual event.
Okay.
In this context, it's simply talking about overtopping of this, when the water levels of the tide get high enough to go over the top of the stream or the side of the mangrove and start flooding the mangrove forest. So it's a kind of a bit of a different context. Obviously, as soon as that water just pushes up above and starts flooding horizontally, the volume of water coming through increases dramatically. And that's why you see so much more flushing high tide.
Because I think it was the headlines from 24 December, they had to discharge bank had capacity, there was no overtopping, and that's still the case.
Discharge drain.
Yeah. So, listen, to broader terms, just looking at 2.18 of your evidence, your overall conclusions. And my question here, is it correct to say that the modelling that you've undertaken sets the foundation for the environmental management monitoring plan? So it's from there that the further work can be done?
I think so. I think it informs the EMP. It highlights the key determinants and drivers of those high concentrations. And keep reminding ourselves that there are lots of different parts of this discharge. We just focus on T.
Yes. Is there anything, I think I might be repeating myself here, but is there anything that you've identified that might be missing that would be required to be in an EMP for that extra monitoring and modelling work to be undertaken?
I think the importance is that whatever monitoring is done consistently and well over a decent duration of time. And I think the quality of that data is far more important than the quantity of it. That would be my
And with the dye test that you did with the nitrogen levels, this is with Mr. Matarangi as well, was that shown with the modelling from the discharge point to achieve the conditions of consent, or after the 5 years, once the plant is commissioned, I think it's the total nitrogen medium concentration of 5 grams per cubic metre and a 95th percentile concentration of 10 grams per cubic metre. It's quite simplistic, I guess, but from the modelling work that you've done, would you be able to comment on whether that would be achievable?
I might need to break that question down.
Okay, so the modelling work that you did was the concentration of the nitrogen leaving the discharge drain and into the estuary. And this is taken, this is the discharge quality limits that have to be tested and have to be complied with at the discharge. Would that be achievable on the basis of your modelling? Was that something you're able to get from the modelling?
Which clarification?
Yeah,
Those figures saying right there, the limits that are under the discharge, so they come out.
Yes.
You're asking.
Yes.
I'll leave Mr. Coulter to answer that. Do you understand that?
Sorry, I'm sorry. Can you read the comment?
I don't think you can answer that question because the limits, these are based in different units, like this is a load, whereas what we're talking about is a concentration.
Oh, okay.
So they're not really, I mean, they're related, they are related, because they basically get a concentration when you take the flows into water. So I think what you're asking is, is that the concentrations that would result from those loads.
Yes.
Does your model allow the testing of that, if you like? To clarify.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would refer to, there's a table in the sheet of evidence which goes through all the modelling scenarios. And so I'll just refer back to that to make sure that I'm getting the right information.
Oh, that's your table 4.1.
That's a heavy one. Pass the line. So we've got this grams per cubic metre. And so our
What page are you on?
27.
Yes, I think that's
22 actually.
Oh,
Of the PDF we've got, this page 22.
right, okay. Yeah. So I've modelled 8.5 grams per cubic metre in these discharge rates.
Test to supplementary,
No, his evidence is made evidence. Have you got that, Tiffany? Yep.
And
So go through
so
that again.
I've listed the discharge rate, which is a volume meters cubed per second, and then the concentration of that.
So that's where that number comes from.
No. I just need to check. So this is this kind of discharge rate and concentration.
Yeah. So that's flow and concentration.
Yeah, and this is based on the 2019, the 2019, 2020. Yeah. So how can you relate that back to the level and your table?
So is this reflecting the higher levels the higher limits that are
Yes.
now in place.
Yeah.
So 8.5 is the limit now. And so, is that correct?
It's the higher limit.
Yeah, and so
There is no nitrogen limit at the moment, is there?
Not at the
Current.
no.
So we,
Okay. So,
So,
so just based on that scenario, if we assume that that is reflecting numbers that are higher than that, which is definitely conservative. So if that 8.5, is that a measure of the concentration? No, it's not, it's the load. It's the load in, this is grams per cubic metre.
which is the same measure as the load. In the conditions.
The volume of
Peter can help?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what Peter Filter modelled
Mhm.
as calibration base case is against the discharge mass, which is at 0.031 that you see in the top row, which was made up of the average concentration of the discharge at that time. We done our field investigation 2019-2020, multiplied by discharge flow from the wastewater treatment plant.
Okay.
Now, comparing that to the discharge standards or the consent conditions that proposed, which is in the table behind you, we'll see a decrease in that concentration by some margin. So the loads with the new wastewater treatment plant in place will decrease as a result of new wastewater treatment plant being in place. Current consent conditions don't require monitoring of TM or any consent conditions around TM. It's just a manual question, if I understand it correctly.
So I guess the bottom line is, are you comfortable with the modelling and the design that condition 14D for the nitrogen discharge quality can be achieved, which is 5 grams per cubic metre and a 95 percentile concentration of 10 grams per cubic metre?
That's an engineering question that Ash needs to...
And I suppose, Mr. Shandy, you're going to come back and say that will be the design.
absolutely. Absolutely. The plant will be designed to achieve.
Yeah.
Yes, the plant will be designed to achieve those.
Yes, so that's putting aside what's actually been modelled is one thing, but the plant will be designed to achieve that limit regardless of what the actual, well not regardless, but taking into account what the model shows. Yeah. Thank you.
We should go back.
I just have one more question. May or may not be able to. And maybe it just goes back to my understanding of what the modelling addresses. Because one of the questions that we had in the last hearing was about that the focus of everything was on the post-commissioning phase. And so we had a discussion about what happens until then in terms of effects and in terms of nitrogen concentration. But I guess, does your model start from tomorrow? You know, does it incorporate that 5 years before, 4 years, you know, before? It does actually do that, doesn't
The loads in my model are born out of monitoring from a peak period. And so the results you're seeing are based on real values, current levels. And it's a scenario-based model, so we're exploring the same period of time with measured water levels at that time from last year.
Yeah. Thank you, yeah. Sometimes it can be a little overwhelming, trying to incorporate, and because it's been going on for quite a long time, there's been a lot of changes.
Yeah, thank you very much. But if you are around everything, this would be really useful if there's anything. Because I think there might be some, our next step in testing is what the model means in terms of steps. Experts to address what you might create a system. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Mr. President. As I say, we're not seeking to be.
Oh, this one. Yeah, I think if we can, at least start.
So we're now at water quality. Refer first to the supplementary section 32A report. And Mr. King and the bill, on the basis of Ms. Mills' evidence, agree with TCDC's experts that ammonia and nitrate toxicity are not concerns given the high treatment standard. Then there's a reference to a summary of the technical memorandum from Ms. Mill and the refinements recommended in that. As a result of which Mr. King addresses the reduction in existing uncertainties and regarding nitrogen codes post-commissioning. This approach ensures the receiving environment monitoring results are reviewed by the regional council before load increases occur, providing a precautionary and adaptive mechanism aligned with the uncertainties identified in the technical efforts. As discussed in section 7 of that report, I recommend changes in addition to the policy conditions. So, we're passing into the evidence of two of us. Ms. King recommends staged increased discharge controls, a concept which is accepted by TCDC and which is provided for in condition 11. Effective and comprehensive monitoring represents a fundamental component of the adaptive management approach applies at half of this management regime. And of course, Renell, the panel very close to testing the veracity of the inputs to that. Conditions 25 to 30 becomes a fundamental component of that approach. And wants to note in relation to the proposed amendments, trigger values, limits, thresholds, the MMP, and proposed conditions 26C7 and 27 and 28 in treatment to ensure that the potential adverse effects will be minimal minor. So Mr. Cochrane has done supplementary, pretty comprehensive statement of supplementary evidence in addition to his evidence in chief, and that's our capture of the highlights of that. I just set out in the next few paragraphs. You notice, noting at 1811, that section 7 of that evidence notes the main amendments to the EMMP being revised trigger levels, continuous monitoring of surface waters and flows, full restoration of the approach to sampling of fresh water, change to time and groundwater sampling, and so forth as set out. and Peter's conclusion is that these improve the workability of the EMMP is sufficient to avoid any more than minor adverse effects on water quality and provide certainty of outcome to the Regional Council and TCDC. Mr. Cochrane identifies only one model scenario that might require technical response to manage potentially elevated TN concentrations. That is a short-term sequence of low altitude tides at the same time as seasonally high wastewater levels and very low freshwater inputs, and this evidence is here. The rebuttal evidence deals primarily with issues raised by Ms. Graham relating to water quality in her 23 March statement, which related to allegations of incomplete data, removal of sediment in the stream delta being unacceptable, timeframes for investigating potential adverse effects, and the exceedance of the trigger value, and all of those are addressed in Mr. Cochrane's rebuttal evidence, with the main points in relation to each point noted there. So our submission, based on all of that, is that you can be satisfied and can find that ammonia and nitrate toxicity are not a concern in terms of water quality. The proposed conditions are consistent with amendments in the version attached to this growth evidence that are a key part of the adaptive management approach are entirely appropriate. The amendments to the revised EMMP attached to Mr. Cochrane's evidence are appropriate, and that the potential adverse water quality effects arising from the proposal, taking into account the proposed conditions, detailed provisions of the EMMP and the baseline monitoring proposed in the EMMP will be no more than minor. So at that point, Mr. Cochrane will read you his summary from his supplementary statement, and then hit any highlights he has from his rebuttal evidence, or we can do the sentence. So we'll start with chapter 2, Peter, of your summary.
Following the adjournment of the hearing, TDT's completed a program of investigations and hydrodynamic modelling to provide greater understanding of the processes involved in the movement of treated wastewater in the Matarangi arms of the Whangapara Harbour. And you've heard from Peter Quilter and his evidence in chief, and also read his modelling report, the outcomes of that. The key finding from the work that Mr. Quilter carried out is a broader and deeper understanding of the physical environment of the Matarangi Arm and Whangapara Harbour. So they were key uncertainties that were identified at the earlier hearing. Long-term changes in bathymetry, sedimentation in response to sea level rise, and how these factors will affect the mixing and dispersion of the discharge from the treatment plant to the Matarangi stream and into tidal areas of the Matarangi Arm of the harbour. A key finding from Mr. Quilter's work is the role of flood-dominated conditions in the movement of total nitrogen in the stream, where TN is modelled to migrate further upstream that had been previously measured and reported on in the AEE and Mavens in chief. The third finding is sequence of low amplitude tides on elevated nitrogen concentrations as one of the scenarios modified to filter. I've assessed the potential water quality effect by references to 2 areas. The Matarangi embayment area and the Matarangi stream area. Now you have in front of you a copy of Figure 1, which shows those 2 areas. We've got the Matarangi embayment area as it widens out into the estuary proper on the left-hand side of your Figure 1, and the Matarangi stream area. And those 2 areas are separated, as described previously by Mr. Quilter, by what we are calling the Matarangi stream delta, which is an area of sedimentation and shallowing of the bathymetry as the Matarangi stream discharges from the Matarangi stream area into the wider embayment. And we'll come back to that further on in both Mavens, chief and rebuttal. So low concentrations of nitrogen are predicted in the Matarangi embayment area, which is downstream of the Matarangi stream delta. TN concentrations at the Matarangi boat ramp, which you can see, which is on the far left of figure 1, are predicted to be 2/10 of the concentration in the stream delta and less than 1% of the original discharge from the wastewater treatment plant, and generally about less than 0.1 grams of total motion. There is a notable reduction in TN concentrations downstream of the Matarangi stream delta, with modelled concentrations declined by over 50% from points CH7 to CH6. And those are showed in figure 5 of my supplementary results.
I think that's in that document that we got sent through, the PDF of all the figures that's in there as well. That figure.
No, I'm not. Those are the 4 or 5 drawings that, or figures that have been sent through. No, they're not.
No, she's talking about something different. She's talking about the PDF.
Yeah,
What
that
is
one,
it?
yes.
That
Which you might
everything that is a table or an attachment to your evidence should be on there. So, or if you can scroll to the start where it says program supplementary, and then you have
Page 10.
Which figure did you say? Figure 4.
until it starts
You were
scrolling
talking
on top.
about applications.
Right there, go back.
Yeah, but
So that one is where it starts. All your stuff's in there, Peter, so if they refer you to something, you should be able to find it there.
we've got this on that same thing on our screen. Don't worry about that.
So I'll just follow on from 2.5. So there's a notable reduction in TN concentrations downstream of the Matarangi stream delta. So overall, modelling undertaken suggests low levels of environmental risk from TN in the Matarangi embayment area from the discharge of treated wastewater. In terms of the Matarangi stream area, one of the scenarios modelled that might require management intervention and response in the event of elevated nitrogen concentrations involves a short-term sequence of low amplitude tides that coincide with seasonally high wastewater loadings and very low freshwater inputs. And that's normally 4 litres per second freshwater input in the Matarangi stream at State Highway 25 bridge. This scenario has the potential to result in TN and surface water reaching moderate concentrations during these conditions for the current day discharge, lasting up to 7 days, but potentially reaching higher concentrations up to 1 gram per cubic metre later in the term of the consent when wastewater loads, seasonal wastewater loads are higher, and those also typically lasting 7 days. These situations would require careful monitoring, as provided for in the draft EEMP, coupled with an effective strategy to reduce nitrogen concentrations in surface water. Because this is largely tidally driven, the situation is predictable, and there are options available to TCDC provided for in the EEMP to manage nitrogen concentrations in the receiving environment if that becomes necessary. If there are more than nominal freshwater inputs, or if more than nominal freshwater inputs are taken into account, the average model concentrations are in the order of 0.5 grams per cubic metre under low flow conditions, which is 11 litres per second, so that would be big angle low flow, and lower under average flow conditions. Concentrations of less than 0.5 grams per cubic metre over a relatively short period of time are unlikely to result in more than minor occurrences of undesirable periphytal, macrophytal, macroalgal growth or other impacts on the stream. And these would represent what's described by Soil Ecology in 2024 as fair to good conditions, respectively. On the basis of the analysis described above, I assessed adverse effects of discharges from the Matarangi wastewater treatment plant on water quality, in the Matarangi embayment area and Matarangi stream areas no more than minor. And this can be maintained over time with the implementation of measures contemplated by the proposed consent conditions and adaptive management regime. Ms McIntosh's evidence addresses ecological effects having regard to this level of effect. In response to the findings of the modelling work, the supplementary Section 42 report and supporting technical memoranda and draft conditions, TNT has revised the draft EMP, which is attached as to my evidence. And the main amendments include a revised set of trigger levels for surface water quality, including where they will apply, a full explanation of the approach to freshwater sampling that takes account of seasonal conditions, modelled variations in TN concentrations over one tidal cycle, and the effects of low amplitude tide and low freshwater outputs on elevated TN. Changes include continuous monitoring of rainfall at the wastewater treatment plant, water levels and flows in the Matarangi stream, and water levels at the Matarangi program. Madam Chair, you had a question of Peter Quilter before, asking was there anything that was missing in the EEMP from his modelling that should be included, and one of the discussions that Mr. Quilter and I had this morning was high frequency of monitoring of TN at the program, high frequency of monitoring of nitrogen. Look, if the hearings committee was of an opinion to include that as a requirement in the EMP, I wouldn't have any objection to that. And the reasons why I haven't included it is the model variations and concentration of TN at the program is relatively low. Now, I will just point you to so next, so you're able to go to figure 5.
Yeah. No problem.
Keep going down, and should be in sequence.
It's a wee bit difficult to see there, but there is model TN concentrations, and this is in the base case of Mr. Quilter, that shows the model concentrations at the boat ramp. Now that's in green, so it's labelled RA, it's in green. You can see there is some changes in concentration, but the amplitude of that is really low. So I don't suspect there will be a huge amount of variation, but I will sort of defer to Mr. Quilter in terms of, from a modelling point of view, if there was more information that needed to be gathered, that would be a useful place for us to do that.
What's the laboratory level of detection, do you know? There's not much point collecting all this information if you can't actually detect it.
Off the top of my head, I don't necessarily know the level of detection for total nitrogen, and it will depend on a range of other factors as well, and it may become more complicated with seawater. But I think in terms of giving us more confidence about how we may be able to use that to predict future situations that we might need to manage, I think it's probably worthwhile exercise that at least over that baseline period, we collect that information to understand a little more. It may not tell us anything, but I think it would be worthwhile to do.
No result is still a good result. No data. A negative result is still a result.
monitoring 213D, undertaking a statistical analysis of the data collected after completion of baseline monitoring to better understand the power of the data collected and improve the quality and robustness of data collection. The inclusion of responses to hold increases to the wastewater treatment discharge as a result of a response activity or at the discharge thresholds over the term of consent. Now, this might be a wee bit of tense between myself and Ms. Procroft, but effectively what we're proposing is that over the term of the consent as wastewater discharges increasing, we're suggesting that we review that at any increase above that post-commissioning discharge of 50 cubic metres per day, so it discharges on average through a year increase by up to 50, that we reevaluate the data that we've got. If the evaluation of the data indicates that we could increase that increment by 50 cubic metres per day, then that could support our increase. If we're in a situation where we're responding to a trigger level in some way, shape or form, then our recommendation was that TCDC would need to hold that discharge and not increase to such time as there's confidence that any further increase would result in any further effect that is more likely.
Yeah, that was one of my questions around that whole management of that proposal. I'm not quite sure how we can explain it better for me, but I mean, what are the mechanisms by which you would put that staging in place? How do you know when, and is it an actual stopping of that discharge to reduce it to down to 50 cubic meters? I'm really a bit lost on that one, how that would work.
But effectively, it's not a. It's doing the work in anticipation of an increase, and not necessarily as a result of the potentially needing to pull back.
Right.
If we're in a situation, let's say for argument's sake, that we were, some of the environmental monitoring that we were doing indicated that we were breaching or exceeding the trigger levels, then that discharge would need to be largely held static until such time as that was resolved. And there's a consent condition that was helpfully raised in the Section 42A report that said maintain it sort of plus or minus 5%, which deals with the practicalities of connections and what have you.
That was my question was going to, how do you, if you've got this load coming in, how do you stop it?
And look, the practicalities of doing that from a wastewater facility operator, that sits with the Matarangi District Council to answer. They do have, my understanding would be that they have an approval process for connections, but that might be a question that Mr. Dishbandi might be able to better answer on behalf of them.
Because it's been put up, not storage facilities, that it's been put up as a response action within the environment management plan. So it's just having the confidence for us that how that's going to work, when it will work, and that it's actually feasible.
There's possibly two things that I'm not quite know what the right term is, that perhaps we're joining together, which might be useful in terms of not separating it. One is the process that I talked about to enable incremental increases of wastewater discharges up to what the consent comprises. So that's a sort of stepwise process where the information that's being collected can be evaluated. We can make a call or a decision on whether a further increase would have the result, or have the potential to result in an adverse effect of this water liner or not. So that's one process that is over time the consent starts to roll out. The other, in terms of storage, largely relates to the scenario that Mr. Quilter described, which was a situation where we've got high seasonal loads coupled with low tidal conditions, coupled with low freshwater inputs. Now, further monitoring that we're proposing will be able to better identify those conditions, and we should be able to then be able to largely predict them out. Because if they're driven on tidal cycles, we have a prediction of when those would
So
occur.
it would be retroactive, but you'd be doing it.
You'll be able to do that proactively, yes. And the modelling that Mr. Quilter has done has given us some indication in terms of the extent to which we can reduce the discharge over a reasonable period of time, so that's maybe up to 7 days, and then subsequently discharging the stored water without necessarily ending up with elevated nitrogen concentrations later on in that tidal cycle. So there is a wee bit of a balancing act in terms of how we would approach that. Certainly that period of baseline monitoring will help give us a much better indication of how we'd be able to manage that with storage, because there is a wee bit of an issue that we could just put off a period of time when TU concentrations are elevated by storing too much and needing to discharge it later. And so there is a wee bit of sort of active management. Over, particularly over pre-commissioning 4-year baseline period, we'll be able to much better picture in terms of how we would be able to manage that.
And that modelling the pre-commissioning is, as I understand it, to commence with consent. Yeah, so there's no time there. It's that was in the.
That's correct.
And that information then was built into Mr. Bushman's design as well.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
When you can pass, sorry, in the middle of your summary, but when you were talking about in order to reduce to acceptable less than minor effects, because that's the trend. Where do you get that information from to know what the actual effects are? Because that's what we'll be asking probably this protocol as well. That seems to be a little bit of a hole for us, is that the modeling's been done and the assessment on that, so you know have a good idea of what now is taking place in the industry. But do you, in terms of wood quality, have an idea and have one? I just don't know that I've seen it anywhere, what your effects assessment is of that water quality aspect of the discharge. Because the EMP seems to be going a bit backwards. It talks about we'll address things so that they aren't more than minor adverse effects, but I'm really not sure how we know what those adverse effects are.
So, did you have
I didn't say anything. No.
sorry.
Introduce the answer.
So the adverse effects that I believe that we should be concerned on is the ecological expression of elevated nutrients. We're not talking about acute toxic effects on wildlife from the discharge. So I think we can sort of effectively move on from that. So it's the effects of nitrogen in particular in fueling plant growth. And so the effect of the modelled nitrogen concentrations or the measured nitrogen concentrations, the effect of that is going to be, they'll indicate a pressure on the environment in terms of what that response might be. And that response will be potentially the production of macroalgae, the production of phytoplankton. It might include enrichment of nutrients and sediment, which in turn then might affect the amount of oxygen in the sediment, and might affect or influence plant or algal growth. So the effects that we're concerned about, the ecological effects, that are going to largely manifest themselves in those intertidal areas. Now that's an area that
Yes. So you're confident and from the information that you've got, that there's not toxicity in terms of water quality, and that is it quantifiable, or how much in terms of the ecological adverse effect? I mean, you've said that is the potential effect, but do you know what it is in terms of quantifying that from the modelling, or is it?
we wouldn't be able to quantify it from modelling, and we may even be able to struggle quantifying it from just the water quality data that we're collecting by ourselves. So the water quality data and the triggers that we're proposing suggest that if we're getting into situations where we're getting elevated levels of nitrogen in certain locations over a period of time, we would need to see whether that was manifesting itself in an effect like macroalgal growth, for instance. So we still need to draw that conclusion that macroalgal growth, if it occurred, was a result of elevated nitrogen in the water column, that in turn was a result of wastewater treatment.
So you're needing to do the EMP is it integral to sort of going back and then confirming assessment of effects? Just using the word for assessment of effects and then mitigation and management techniques, rather than management and monitoring techniques to go back and identify what the adverse effects are.
No, look, I don't believe so. I think by supplementary evidence suggested that some of the conclusions and opinions that I reached in my evidence of the chief still stand, that identified an area upstream of the Matarangi bridge that was in some regards different to where the evidence of the chief and ADE was focused on. Now, that has been something that my colleague, Ms. McIntosh, has gone and investigated, albeit briefly, to make sure that on the back of the initial modelling that was done, there were no observations of adverse effects that were more than minor as a result of what the modelling under the current data scenario was showing us. And she draws a conclusion that there were some minor evidence of enrichment in some of that intertidal area, but she couldn't conclusively draw that to that being the wastewater treatment plant. So the other thing to bear in mind, can you go up to figure 1?
Yeah, it's 2 minutes.
Figure 1. Oh, sorry, it's just taking a wee bit of time.
Takes time, yeah.
Figure 2, sorry.
Right.
Again, my apologies, this is a wee bit difficult to see here. But what it shows is over that period of time that we did the water quality work in 2019, 2020, Mr. Cook was able to go back and get tidal water level conditions over that period of time and use that model to model TU concentrations, and those are at the boat ramp, which at the Matarangi bridge, the top one. And what you can see there is quite a significant change in concentration as a result of, or model concentration as a result of the tide coming in and the tide going out. The circles and the dots are the measured results. And in some respects, we're getting relatively good convergence between what's modelled and what's measured, but it does break down in some other situations, and hence that need for more higher frequency monitoring to understand how TN concentrations change over the course of the tidal cycle. So I think that gives us an idea of where elevated nitrogen is going to be. Gives us an idea of what the variability is from over a tidal cycle. But then we also need to consider that an individual high nitrogen result won't necessarily manifest itself in an ecological response. It's that pressure over a longer period of time. Which then comes back to the scenario work that Peter has done and just concentrating on that period of high seasonal influence, sensitive environmental conditions.
Sorry, I thought it's not even anyway, but yeah, it was it's related to the modelling that need to be comfortable with.
So I think, with the so what the modelling has told me is probably two things that are different from when I was last in the hearing.
Tidal project.
And that upstream influence, so that's different. We're not necessarily seeing that difference in the data that we've collected at that Matarangi bridge, which is on the top one there. But we recognise that the model is showing that variation, so it may be just something we missed. The other thing that the monitoring has informed us is that we did need to look upstream, and this Macintosh can address briefly what she saw in response to that. And then the other one is, again, this more a period of time where we need to be more cautious with the conditions, the environmental conditions, where we may need to think about how we manage the discharges from the wastewater treatment plant. So I'll pick up from 213. So we talked about the inclusion of responses to wholly increases the wastewater cluster discharges as a result of either response activity being in place or at certain thresholds over the term of the consecutive confidence that further increments in discharge volume does not result in an adverse effect. It's more minor. The inclusions of time frames for completion of those response actions. And look, I believe these improve the workability of the EMP. I think they provide certainty of outcome to both the regional council and the consent holder, and are sufficient to avoid significant adverse effects or effects of the design. The supplementary Section 42A report and technical memoranda has provided very useful perspectives and advice, most of which has been taken on board and included in the EMP. As I said before, I support the proposed requirements to hold discharges at certain times and in certain places during the consent. And the provision of further clarity on reporting timeframes. And while I support the concept of use of trigger levels as a means to assess environmental effects of discharge from wastewater treatment plant over the duration of the consent, it was my view that this is best placed outside of the consent conditions and included in the EMP, where they can be, in quotes, tweaked alongside the regional council, like further knowledge without undergoing a section 127 consent change process.
So, I mean, I'm happy to wait till the end because it's only got a ring. It's up to you. I mean, I had a
It is something that really is exercising us with the two different views of the report and noting the case study and the legal submission. Obviously, our responsibility is to make sure we have first of all a reasonable consent condition. Achieve the rationale of not wanting to put in a consent condition that requires a section 127 change. He says he argues, or there is the argument of why we need to trigger and the DMP. It's just don't want you to miss what should be an opportunity, which is 42A report seems to say, put it in as a consent, put the trigger in the consent condition, and then manage the response to achieve once a trigger is set within the EMP, and it is the effective safety basically, help us out.
Yeah. But my response is maybe in other situations where I've been dealing with clients that have consent conditions on not necessarily discharge limits, but environmental outcomes that are set as consent conditions. And an example is there's one where I've got a client that's got a trigger level around boron. And that was at the time when there were certain understood guideline values around boron. And there was an action that they were required to take in response to an exceedance in boron and their stormwater discharges. But that guideline changed. There was a number of scientific publications that were released, and as a result of that, the Australia, New Zealand Environmental Council, ANZEC, decided to change those guidelines. So we ended up in a situation where it became difficult. We ended up in a response situation dealing with a trigger level that was out of date and science had moved on. So there was a lot of reporting required on them. We had approached the regional council involved in saying, hey, could we change that? I said, well, the only way we can really change that is through a change in the consent conditions of section 127 process. That not necessarily unwise, but that sort of brings in a level of complexity associated with what otherwise should be a relatively straightforward scientific response. And the body that set guideline levels that most water quality scientists in New Zealand would follow has changed that level. Then, because it was previously in a consent condition and that level got increased, then you had a consent holder that was really restricted in terms of what they could do and needing to report on situations where they're exceeding a guideline level that was effectively out of date. So I think there is a sort of real practical consideration in there that ends up being a pain in the neck after a period of time. I certainly get the concept of increased certainty in consent conditions, but I think that we need to couple that with a high degree of certainty that the trigger levels can prevail relevant over the sort of term of the consent.
So with the environment-based community, I know we should be asking these kind of questions, but I think what I understand is he's saying that it's really a condition and being managed absolutely the trigger's moved, conditioning it must be there, and then WRC has to certify that or go to
It's not something along those lines.
yes. So would that process of being taken, if we really agree to take the trigger out, if we really agree to have triggers in there, within the EMP versus the condition, it will still provide the same level of protection. Trigger. And I just confused myself on that question.
Yeah, but again, it's around certainty, and I get where the section 4A report has got is that it's got two in terms of their recommendation, which is around we want certainties that are enshrined in consent conditions. And my view is that I understand the desire to do that, but I also think that trigger levels need to have a degree of flexibility associated with them. Now, they're not consent conditions. And I think this is something that perhaps some of the submitters got themselves confused. Well, there are consent conditions around quality of the wastewater that's being discharged. And yeah, those are ones that they're non-negotiable. And those are things that the consent holder can influence in terms of wastewater treatment processes, so they can ensure compliance with those discharge standards that are set as consent conditions. What we're talking about here is what we're monitoring in the environment. So if I said, I've said it before in both my evidence and my supplementary evidence, that if we get a situation where we've got an exceedance of the trigger level, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's an adverse effect that's fallen line. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's, if you're under the EMP, that's a breach of consent conditions. It's something that requires the consent holder to manage and respond to. Now that certainty is in the EMP in terms of management responses and timeframes associated with that. If it was brought into the consent conditions, then you're in a situation where the consent holder overdetermined the consent has got very little flexibility to move in terms of those trigger levels without seeking a change. Those trigger levels could go up or they could go down, we just don't know. And as science develops, our understanding of the environment will develop as well. And then we've got it's got the added complication of those effects on water quality, as I said, are demonstrated in the ecological response that Ms. McIntosh is going to talk to. So it's not a sort of a direct causal chain between elevated nutrient concentrations, ecological effect. It's probably a little bit more nuanced. There are things that might play out more over sort of different timescales. It's not as straightforward as the discharge conditions, which is set into a median TE concentration of 5 grams per cubic metre over the course of the year.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah, just one comment. I have nothing wrong with this grant and individual supplementary discussed. I think this is really helpful in the environment, trying to have that more.
Well, actually, that's where I don't think it does.
That's a good example at all.
No, it's not.
No, it's not a good
That was
example.
going to be my question. No, because that doesn't relate to what they've got in the EMP at all. As I read it, the trigger levels in there, the interim water quality triggers, are for flexibility in terms of what might happen in the environment, not in terms of changes in legislation or guidelines.
Yeah.
So I thought I was actually going to question that was a very useful example. I think that's what the trigger levels being in the EMP versus the conditions was intended to address.
Because my question is actually around, you talk about the tweaking of the trigger level, and this gives us discomfort, basically. I know you're dealing with natural systems, But it's like, what confidence can the panel have that the tweaks won't actually result down the track? There'd be such a magnitude that you would actually have to reassess your effects. So that's a risk, and it's an unknown risk for us as the panel because there's so limited baseline information. And to me, that's why you are talking about tweaking the triggers, because you don't have enough baseline information to have confidence that the triggers you have proposed are actually going to be reflective of your situation. And I apologise, that's not a question, that's a statement, but it's just we're just trying to work our way through this. And so I guess, you know, what confidence can we have that this tweaking is, you know, and that's where the difference between having it as a condition versus having it as an E&P, that's where, that gives that level of confidence.
And we do understand the difference between the limit.
Yes,
so
we know what
is the, you know, it's in the condition because that's what is the limit. And these triggers are for you know, identifying when you have to take more action or investigate things. Understand that. But yes, there's Murray saying it feels like going through the advice we're getting from through the supplementary 42A report that feels like we need more certainty around that as a condition rather than as a so that you're not at a point that you can put those trigger levels as a condition.
I'm happy to have them as a condition now. My concern is in 10 or 15 years' time that they might be inappropriate. So it might either be too conservative or not conservative enough to protect the environment.
What would that be based on?
Yeah. Why?
Why would they change apart from guidelines?
Well, they may change in terms of guidelines. And that's probably my main concern is that, you know, these are being informed by a range of guidelines and let's sort of put aside current changes in terms of things like policy statements. You know, I believe we still need to reflect that science might move on to determine consent.
Could you address that concern as, like it's more legal, as an advice note under that condition, that section 127 is not required in the agenda? I mean, that you do have some advice notes like that.
If I were to discuss it a little bit and need to discuss it further,
Yeah.
thinking along the lines of if the triggers is sufficient, set it up in such a way that those conditions are close to the is the first off, and then you have a review process there and certain changes like the process or some implementation, there's already conditions in there that you can subject to instructions on it and discuss
It's just something that, I mean, I appreciate the 127, it might be over the top for it, but yeah, it was, it comes back to what we've been talking about in terms of certainty, and we've got the advice through the supplementary 42A report.
But I think in that regard, we have to give this a lot of thought. The paradigm, I think, that the supplementary section 42A report drives off is you've got section 127 or a certification process, which is essentially a tick the box exercise. But there's something in between that can be drafted as a condition that says, prove this, prove this, prove this, and that can change by a studio section 127, but within the conditions themselves. And I've seen that quite a number of times, where something that, and I must say, I mean, NZTA are very good at trying to get on everywhere they go, but there's so much in their management plans. I mean, having just done a 16-kilometre motorway, that was our big tension. But you can provides a process that is technically robust, and not a technical boxing exercise. Yeah, and I think we can come up with something.
And for submitters, as I said at the beginning of the hearing and the meeting today, when we're talking about conditions, we just have to test everything out. It's not that we're sort of saying, yeah.
When I think, if I'm thinking back to the Matarangi wastewater treatment facilities, and I'm now talking in the 90s, but I was 14, where it's not uncommon to find conditions that enable parameters to be tweaked following review by a peer review panel, for example. Which is independent. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
So it's not a foreign concept, it's just that you can get the coverage right.
Yeah, it's just that as the EUMP is written at the moment, looking at 2.2 for the levels of threshold, table 1 interim water quality triggers, and then the explanation for it will be established to set up a early warning system. It's an interim, so it says interim, So why is it interim? Yeah.
I think this conversation is not what I had, because, if you have feelings that we'd like to know about. That, so that's very helpful.
No,
Yeah. We have got more questions. And it's probably it also feeds into the EMP. I'm not sure if that's this protocol for everyone. Yes, I think it covers. Yes, that's right.
the EMP?
Can I just ask Sheree, we have trouble because of here that.
Oh, sorry.
That's all I'm trying to get your opinion.
Yeah, sorry, it's not a good, we'll try and speak.
So we didn't hear a word of what the legal guy contributed.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
can you work in, sorry, Derek, no, Mr. Malone,
Oh.
you were quite quiet.
Oh, sorry, I can be quite loud.
Yeah, I think he was saying that.
I think
Yeah.
I can ask, sorry,
Mr. Malone, do you just want to recap the discussion that we've had? It was around, where did you sort of get left off? It was around the trigger levels, them being in the EMP versus conditions.
correct.
Yeah.
In the tweaking question.
Yes, yes. And so Mr. Malone addressed, when I asked, was made a suggestion, or was it possible to have it as a condition, but with like an advice note? And that was his response was he was
So what he
looking
indicated,
into it.
what he indicated is that we can have a situation in which the conditions require the trigger levels to be set at a certain level now, and then for a process within the consent to enable those to be tweaked, not via a certification process, but a more substantive process following the issuing of a report. Is that okay?
Well, it's kind of along those lines, and
Yeah.
we need to do some more talking about it, but that's the gist of it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you. It triggers different proceedings.
Yeah.
All right, well, I think we might just wait for lunch now. We're still, I know we appreciate we're in the middle of your presentations, but we have, just as a heads up, we've probably got questions, I know we have questions, about the response actions that expect. And still also, I guess we're going to be testing the ecological effects, where the effects, what are the effects and how are they actually known in order to address them with management. We just want a little bit more clarity around that. That summarise it?
Oh, yeah, and a range of other things.
Okay. I can all go for 2 o'clock. We're making good time, and it just gives everyone a break. There's a little bit of right up. So, thank you very much, everyone.